first of all, and this is to everybody, especially the students, but anybody who takes an interest in the Mind, Technology, and Society series. I hope that you will come back throughout the semester. I believe it's on the events page now for our department. You can look through all of the exciting talks we're going to be looking forward to. But none more exciting, arguably, than the one we have in store today. Randy Beer is a professor of cognitive science, computer science, and informatics at Indiana University, and his research explores how organisms operate as integrated wholes, with a particular focus on how behavior arises from the interaction between brains, bodies, and environments. This should sound like welcome, red meat for our group. Professor Beer works on the evolution and analysis of dynamical nervous systems for model agents, neuromechanical modeling of animals, biologically inspired robotics, and dynamical systems approaches. This research program has been extremely productive. It's generated not only 2 books, but also just in the last year or 2, recent publications in journals such as Proc-B, Current Opinion in Neurobiology, and a lot of papers in Artificial Life. I say something about what we're going to hear about today, and a talk on autopoiesis? Autopoiesis and enaction in the game of life. So let's please welcome Professor Beer.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
I usually have a pretty projective voice, so I hope it lasts the whole 90 minutes that we're talking. All right, well, it's great to be here. I'm glad I finally made it, since this is a rescheduling from last semester where there was a little bit of excitement, I hear, in California. So I don't know how the focus of this series is, but this is pretty much was intended as a talk in the Theories of Mind series. So I think it fits best in that. I don't know if you've got your own spin on things this semester.
This is a cornucopia of things.
Okay, well, it certainly fits in a cornucopia. So, all right, so let me just dive right in. Depending on how you look at it, cognitive science has either been blessed or cursed with a fairly rich set of theoretical frameworks for thinking about cognition. I'm only showing a few of them here just to kind of give us a sample. You could put dots between all of these. And there are different ways, different approaches you can take to sort of adjudicating between these different ideas. For example, verbal debate is a very common one, where people talk about why they think it's one way versus another, and we calmly and rationally discuss the pros and cons of these different perspectives. Unfortunately, this sort of verbal exchange of views often degenerates into a kind of dueling intuitions about the right way to think about what's really going on in a cognitive system or in a brain or something. So I take a somewhat different approach, which I've recently been describing in this way, because once you've got enough work behind you, you sort of step back and try to make some sense of does it all fit together or not. And this is my latest attempt to kind of do that. So the way I think about the approach I take is I start with a theoretical framework. Okay? It could be dynamics, for example, which is one that I've worked on, but it could be other combinations of these things. And I develop a toy model, or one or more toy models, that try to exemplify some of the ideas in that framework. Okay? And then I try to build theories of that toy model. So I try to take it seriously, we do experiments on it, we build mathematical descriptions of it, we try and ultimately calculate the consequences of this theory. Okay, now I want to be clear, consequences for the toy model. Okay? And then we evaluate the utility of what we've done, and we refine it. So for example, it could be that the theory we've built doesn't do a very good job of accounting for the properties of the toy model. The theory needs to be improved. It could be that the toy model itself turns out to not have done a very good job of capturing the key ideas of the theoretical framework that it was supposed to exemplify. And it could be that as you've worked through this loop over and over again, you just can't seem to find a way to cash out all the intuitions in the theoretical framework in a way that actually means anything, that actually turns into anything more than sort of wet tissue paper when you try and flesh it out. Okay? So round and around we go with this loop. And I've spent most of my career basically applying this sort of approach to situated, embodied, and dynamical perspectives on cognition and behavior. And I've been doing that by developing and analyzing a series of brain-body environment models, where you take all of these pieces seriously and your object of study is the entire brain-body environment system. And we've done work on this ranging from sort of basic motor control and perception all the way up to what we call minimally cognitive behavior, things like relational categorization and referential communication. And most recently, we've extended some of this work to also include some ideas about the processing of information within this kind of a framework. In particular, looking at how Shannon information theory and dynamical systems theory fit together when you apply both of them to the study of the same system. So I'm not going to talk about any of that today, but I'm trying to put this in a context at least where what I am going to talk about makes sense. What I want to do today is look a little bit into how the same strategy might be applied to a completely different theoretical framework, namely the theoretical framework of enactivism, or as I will argue, a sort of pre or proto-enactivism that we need to understand first before we fully grapple with enactivism. So the inactive approach, or enactivism as it's called now, was first popularized in this 1991 book by Varela, Thompson, and Rosch. And in a sense proliferated in many, many different directions. This is by no means all of the books, hence the ... There's been a real explosion in the past few years of books on enactivism. And if you look carefully at it, as I'm not going to do today, there's a lot of branches, some of which don't even fit together very well anymore. Okay? So it's one of the reasons why I want to kind of go back to first principles in some sense. And in this sort of proto or primitive enactivism I want to focus on, there are basically two ideas. And these both come from Varela's work predating his 1991 book with Thompson and Rosch. And that is autonomy and enaction itself, which is where the enactivism comes from. So both of those ideas are actually grounded in earlier work that Varela did with Maturana on what was called the biology of cognition. And in particular, the two key ideas of Maturana and Varela's work were autopoiesis, which Varela generalized into the notion of autonomy. That was one of his contributions to enaction. And the other idea was structural coupling from the biology of cognition, which, again, Varela extended into this notion of enaction. And very roughly speaking, autopoiesis is a proposal for understanding the relationship of biology to the underlying physical chemistry. And structural coupling is a proposal for understanding the relationship between biology and cognition, hence the biology of cognition that this approach was originally termed. And what I've been trying to do, basically, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is, as I said in that earlier slide, using a concrete toy model, I want to try and explore how autopoiesis bridges this gap between physics, chemistry, and biology, and how the notion of structural coupling bridges the gap between biology and cognition. However, I only have the 45 minutes, and so what I'm going to focus on is the structural coupling piece of things. And in one slide, I'm going to try and explain this toy model that I'm using, as well as the rough idea of how that toy model deals with autopoiesis without going into all of the details. Okay? But I have some additional slides. We can talk more about that if you want, but I had to pick some focus. I also want to put a warning here where this is very much a research program in progress. Okay? So it's taking these ideas, all verbally expressed, and trying ultimately to sort of formalize them, to be able to mathematically express them. And I have by no means completed that endeavor. Okay, so let's start with the one slide review of the model we're going to be using and of the idea of autopoiesis captured in that model. So the toy model I'm using is John Conway's Game of Life, Cellular Automata. This basically consists of a two-dimensional sort of universe, if you will, of cells. I don't mean biological cells, I mean grid cells, lattice cells, just little squares that can be in only one of two states, on or off. So it's a binary universe and it's two-dimensional. And the time evolution of this toy universe is governed by a single universal law that Conway proposed, which is local in both time and space. And again, it's universal, it applies across the entire grid. The details of the law don't matter. I've heard some of you have actually implemented Game of Life. Others of you, it's easy to look up. The bottom line is the state of a cell in this universe, its next state depends in some simple way on its current state and the sum of the states of all of the neighbors around it. And it turns out, so I'm going to think of this as a kind of physics. That's not the way Conway thought of it. He actually thought of it as a kind of biology. But for my purposes, that would be a very uninteresting object to study because it kind of presumes, it presupposes a particular account of what a biological system is. And that's not the sort of thing we want to just grant a priori. It's the sort of thing we want to try and derive from the underlying physics. Okay? And it turns out that this simple physics, which I sometimes call the Conway physics, to of course distinguish it from real physics, the physics that we experience on a day-to-day basis. It turns out what's amazing about this, if you're not familiar with it, is this really simple law applied to a two-dimensional universe is capable of supporting rich pattern-forming dynamics. Okay. So in this one-slide review, I'm just going to skate right along. From this Conway physics, we basically derive a chemistry. So this chemistry involves local arrangements of components of ones and zero cells. So we're talking about their arrangements now, not just an individual cell, but the actual layout of groups of cells, trigger specific reactions that are given by the Conway physics, and those local arrangements through the reactions produce new local arrangements. Okay, so we actually have a simple artificial chemistry that's grounded in this underlying physics. And it turns out if you study the time evolution of these Game of Life universes from random initial conditions, one of the interesting things you see is that there are these bounded persistent spatiotemporal patterns that arise and propagate and interact with other things and so on. This is showing a simple example of that called a glider because it glides across the universe. And if we ran these things, you would see, and I have some slides of this too if we have time later, but you see there's a whole bunch of these kinds of structures that arise. I'm only focusing on the glider because it's in some sense the simplest one that's interesting, that's rich enough to be interesting, as I will try and argue. So using this chemistry, we can work out the underlying network of processes that generate and support the persistence of a spatiotemporal pattern like the glider. I'm not going to go through all the details, but every one of these nodes corresponds to a particular kind of reaction, and the links between the nodes correspond to interdependencies between the components of one reaction and the triggers of another reaction. So this is basically a reaction network that generates the glider and preserves it as it wiggles around and moves across the environment, grounded in the chemistry that we derived from the Conway physics. Okay? And it turns out, again, this is just a review. I haven't given you enough information to convince you of any of this. I'm just asserting it as background. It turns out that we can show that under a particular interpretation of Maturana and Varela's notion of autopoiesis, that this network of processes underlying a glider satisfies the two conditions of autopoiesis, which they called self-production and self-distinction. Okay? So the punchline of all of this, which I'm not going into detail about, is that we have this sort of emergent precarious individual that comes out of a network of processes grounded in a particular toy model physics, whose behavior, whose interactions with its environment we can study. And that is the topic of what I want to talk about today. Okay? I don't know what the question pattern is like, but I think what we had talked about was if there are any questions of clarification, you should ask them dynamically. If there are questions of discussion like, wait, why are you doing this? Maybe we should leave that for the discussion period afterwards so I can at least get through the arc of the argument that I want to make. Okay? So again, if there are questions of clarification here as to roughly what I'm doing, now would be the time to ask them. Otherwise, we're going to launch ahead, assuming this glider is an entity whose behavioral interactions with its environment are interesting to study. Okay? All right. So, the first thing we have to talk about is what is the glider's environment? And, oh, the grays aren't coming through here very well, but I think you can roughly see. So basically, we begin by essentially looking at, and by looking at I mean completely mathematically characterizing the effects that a glider's environment can have on the glider's subsequent behavior. Okay? So to do that, we have to recognize a couple of things. One is that a glider takes on two basic forms as it wiggles its way through an environment. Okay? These forms can be embedded with different chiralities, different handednesses, and also different orientations, but internally they only take on these two forms. And I don't know, at least for me, it was most memorable to call this form a wedge and this form a rocket. Right? So it looks like a rocket with an asymmetrical fin. Sorry, that's what they look like to me. So anyway, I'm going to be calling these two forms wedge and rocket. And if we pull one of these glider forms out of its environment, it leaves behind a sort of glider-shaped hole whose inner boundary, I've colored yellow here, that is the interface through which all effects of the environment on the glider have to pass. Okay? So I'm going to call that a one environment for obvious reasons, because we could also define a two environment, which is the next further away, and so on. I'm only going to focus on the one environment today. And if you count these up, there are 24 cells. Each cell can be on or off, so there are 2 to the 24th, or around 17 million possible one environments that a glider can find itself in. Does that make sense? So to characterize what effect an environment has on a glider, we just have to study 17 million things. That may sound like a lot, but it's actually quite simple to do on a computer. The first distinction I want to make is the following. If you look at those 17 million odd environments, there are two broad things that they can do to a glider. The first thing they can do is destroy the glider. Okay? Because the glider itself is a precarious structure, it's not given a priori. I'm not building it into the program. It arises from this network of interactions. That network of interactions can be disrupted. And some perturbations from the one environment will disrupt the glider's network, its organization, and it disintegrates. Now, there's nothing much more interesting to say about that, right? If something kills you, then you no longer have any interesting behavior after that point. Okay? So the interesting thing that we're going to be focusing on are the non-destructive interactions, the subset of one environments such that the glider organization persists, but its structure may change. So it could change, for example, from a wedge to a rocket. It could change its chirality. It could change its orientation. It could move. Okay? There are effects that those perturbations have on a glider which are not destructive. So we're going to focus our analysis on the non-destructive perturbations. Okay. So we apply all 17 million odd perturbations to both a wedge and a rocket, because those are the two possibilities, right? We toss out all destructive perturbations, and the remaining non-destructive perturbations we want to study. What kind of patterns do we see in that? So it turns out that if you do all those perturbations, what you find is that all of the non-destructive perturbations fall into one of 6 classes. If you count it up, there's 144 possible non-destructive effects that a perturbation could have on a glider. Only these 6 are seen. Okay? So for a wedge, so I put a wedge in a standard configuration, but if I turned it this way, then all these would turn too. So I'm sort of dividing out the symmetries here and just focusing on the fundamentally different things. If you apply any perturbations in, say, this class to a wedge, you get a rocket oriented like this. Okay, if you apply any of these, you get a rocket oriented like this, and so on. There are 4 possible classes, and if you apply all 2 to the 24th perturbations to a rocket, there are only 2 possible classes. Now we have a labeling problem here. The glider somehow sees every perturbation that does this in the same way. It's grouping all those different perturbations into the same class. Okay? We don't have a name for that class in our language because we don't speak gliderese, right? And you'll see these are very odd classes that it kind of puts together. So I've arbitrarily labeled them with colors. Okay, gliders obviously don't see colors, but I'm going to call that the black, blue, brown, and orange perturbation classes, and I'm going to call this the gray and green perturbation classes. Okay? So, for example, if you take any perturbation that's in this class and apply it to a glider or to a wedge in this form, you will see that the chirality flips. It flips from right-handed to left-handed, and the orientation stays the same. It shifts by 1 cell horizontally and vertically, and it changes from a wedge to a rocket. So each of these classes can be described in that way, or they can be described in much finer detail. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it turns out that we can write down a set of equations that have to be satisfied that are grounded in the Conway physics, such that, for example, this wedge makes a Brown transition. And we can algebraically simplify those equations and then solve them to produce the set of perturbations that fall into the Brown class. There are 8,192 of them. And furthermore, we can characterize their structure. So every Brown perturbation has that cell on, these cells off. These cells can take any pattern, and these cells are constrained by a set of equations which arise from our algebraic simplification of the defining conditions. Okay? So we can do that for all 6 classes. We can actually write down equations and solve them and generate all the members and see what's similar and what's different. Now you see why I used brown and orange and green, because there's no obvious name for this class of patterns versus this class of patterns, even though the glider treats them all the same. Okay? The other thing you can do, which I'm glossing over, is when in writing down and solving those equations, you can see how these different classes are actually grounded in the network, the process network organization that I showed you earlier. Okay, these aren't just, coming out randomly. They're all grounded in that particular set of interdependencies between all the processes that make up the glider organization. And that enters into the equations that you write down. Okay, so a glider experiences a non-destructive perturbation. It's preserved but possibly changed structurally. It's still a glider. If it experiences another non-destructive perturbation, then again it's preserved but persists. And so we end up getting these sequences of non-destructive perturbations. At every point, of course, it can encounter a destructive perturbation, in which case its existence ends and we're no longer interested in it in terms of studying its behavior. Okay? But as long as it persists, you can get these chains of, say, I've only shown 2 levels here. A wedge gets a brown perturbation, turns into this kind of a rocket, which gets a green perturbation, turns into a slightly differently embedded rocket, and so on. Okay? So we build up this structure of non-destructive perturbations that a glider can survive. Yeah?
Do some of these perturbations change the glider's direction and some don't? And is that...
Yes, the perturbations in general can change the form, wedge rocket, it can change the chirality, and it can change the orientation. The one condition I've imposed, which I glossed over earlier, is that the new glider has to be within the light cone of the previous glider, or the causal cone, if you will. In other words, you can't have a glider here impose a perturbation and then a glider pops up over here and call it the same glider. Because there's a speed of light, if you will, in the game of life. It's basically 1 cell per time step. And so this glider's appearance cannot be causally related to this glider's perturbation. So they have to fall within the light cone. So which for a glider is basically a 5 by 5 goes to a 7 by 7, right? And that's the causal cone of effects. And so I've imposed that condition implicitly here. I didn't mention it earlier. Okay, so anyway, if we apply sequences of these perturbations, we map out all the different kinds of interactions a glider can have with its one environment. So here you go. That is essentially the, I'm going to start using words which we should discuss later, but a simple perception action network for the glider. It perceives things, things happen to it and affect it in some way. It changes its structure, it perceives new things and so on. It makes distinctions, it doesn't make distinctions. We've mapped that out here. So each of these nodes corresponds to a particular structure of a glider. And each of the links, each of the arcs correspond to a particular class of perturbations. Okay? So earlier I said, oh well, this isn't shown. I was going to say I said brown orange, but I don't. Brown oranges are down here. So I don't know. You can have a blue, 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 gray sequence, for example, would be one possible path through here. Okay. Now this graph of all the interactions a glider can participate in non-destructively has only been worked out for a glider that's offset 1 unit spatially. So we can work that out again to 2 units and then 3 units and so on. What you find though is that this structure just repeats. So here is the 2 spatial offset version of the graph, and in red here I'm showing how this graph embeds within this 2 unit graph, and then this is the 3 spatial offset graph, and I'm showing how the 2 graph embeds in this 3 graph, right? So in a given glider, in a given game of life universe, this same structure that we worked out here just keeps repeating vertically and horizontally. If the universe is open, then forever. That's an infinite repetition of these things. If, as is more typical, we impose periodic boundary conditions, so we take the left and right sides and we bend them around so that it loops, and we take the top and the bottom and we bend it around so that it loops, and that turns this flat universe into a torus, basically, right? We fold it once, we've got a cylinder, we take the top and bottom of the cylinder and fold them together, we've got a donut, we've got a torus. Okay, so if we apply that topology to the universe, then eventually the left and right and the top and bottom edges of this graph connect up. Okay? All right. Now what I want to talk about is this notion of structural coupling, which was the piece of this topic that I picked for today. So far we've been treating perturbations as if they're completely freely imposable. So I'm basically deciding, let's throw a green perturbation at this thing. Okay, now let's throw a gray perturbation at this thing. But in fact, because this glider and its environment are both embedded in the game of life, they both have to respect the Conway physics. So one perturbation can't arbitrarily follow every other perturbation, because the Conway physics doesn't connect up some of those things. Those states don't follow from one another. Okay, so what I want to do next, and this gets at what structural coupling is all about, is take into consideration the fact that both the environment and the glider have to follow the Conway physics, and the implications that has for the structure of these perturbations. So first, let me just show you an example of what I'm going to call a natural perturbation sequence. So this is one that can actually arise in the game of life universe. So this is a blue, brown, gray, blue, blue, and then destructive perturbation. Now, I could have picked that sequence, or I could have picked any other sequence, but this is a sequence that can actually arise because the cells around the wedge here are evolving to the new arrangement of cells around the rotated wedge in a way that respects the Conway physics. So that environment really can follow from the previous environment. Okay? This is what I mean by a natural sequence. And what we're interested in next is trying to characterize the structure of the set of natural sequences of interaction as opposed to the set of possible ones if you have a sort of godlike entity that can reach in and do anything from the outside. And that's what structural coupling will turn out to be about. The idea is that gliders evolve in a way that's consistent with, number one, the Conway physics, and also with the glider organization. Those two aren't in opposition, it's just that some evolutions of the Conway physics result in states that don't have gliders, right? So the states have to evolve in a way that respects the Conway physics, and because we're focused on gliders, they have to evolve in a way that respects the glider organization. So that means that of this network of possible interactions that a glider can engage in with its environment, and of the network of the possible state changes that the environment can undergo. And I should mention here, this is purely schematic. It's just a pretty graph. I'm going to show you actual environment graphs in a minute. Okay, but this is just a stand-in for how all the other states in the universe can evolve, minus the glider. Okay? So, because of this connection between the two, among all the possible states or transitions that a glider can undergo, this particular sequence of perturbations selects out a subgraph. Right? So this corresponds to the blue, brown, gray, blue, blue, and then that last transition, the glider disappears, so there's no state in this graph that represents a not glider, right? This is only the effects of the environment on a glider. So by imposing a particular environment or putting that glider in a particular universe, we select out subsets of this interaction graph. And the same thing is true for the environment. Of all the state changes that the environment can undergo, when it's coupled to a glider, a particular set of state changes get selected. And this is the idea of structural coupling. The idea that basically gliders and their environments co-determine their mutual paths of structural change. Of all the changes in state that the environment could undergo, the glider selects a particular one. And of all the state changes that a glider can undergo, the environment selects a particular one. So together they co-determine the moves that we see up here. Among the possible moves, there's only a subset of actual moves. And this is what structural coupling means, specifically in Maturana and Varela's framework. This co-determination of an entity and its environment of their mutual changes in state. Okay? And these allow joint glider environment paths. Again, I'm going to use one of these words that will get me into trouble, but I'm going to call this a glider life. Okay? It's a sequence of preserved gliders. It's the same glider under the light cone definition that keeps getting perturbed and moving down particular paths based on the changing states of its environment and its own internal dynamics. And those things eventually come to an end, like this one does, and at that point the glider no longer exists. That's the end of this particular glider life. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, we can work out all the things I just said in detail by focusing on a particular sized universe. Okay? I'm going to start with the simplest, the smallest universe that can actually contain a glider, which is the 5x5 universe. Anything smaller, parts of the glider won't fit in, right? So this is a 5x5 universe, and if we pull the glider out of this universe, the remaining cells constitute the environment. Okay? That's the only other degrees of freedom in the universe that aren't part of the glider. And the other thing to note is that to make this a finite problem, I'm assuming periodic boundary conditions. So these 25 cells are the only cells in the entire universe for the purposes of this slide. Okay? All right. So based on the ideas I said earlier, we can work out the interaction graph for this glider. There are two things to point out. One is you might think this should look exactly like the graph I showed you earlier for a glider that can only move one step. But in fact, that's not true, because in a periodic universe, there are 5 horizontal locations the glider can be in, and 5 vertical locations the glider can be in, as well as the chirality, flips, and the orientations. That's point 1. So there are more nodes in this graph than the one I showed you earlier. And furthermore, this graph, unlike the one I showed you earlier, respects the periodic boundary conditions, so that as you go off one side, it comes back around on the other side. And that means the graph is more densely connected, because there's multiple paths to get to the same point. Okay? But otherwise, this is exactly the same type of graph. Each of these nodes corresponds to one possible structure for a glider, and each of the arcs corresponds to a possible perturbation from a godlike interloper, right? They can reach in and apply arbitrary perturbations one after the other. And similarly, we can do the environment interaction graph, which again is more complicated than you might expect, because there are only 3 cells in this environment, but those 3 cells can occur in many different locations and orientations, all of which are distinct structures. So each of these nodes corresponds to one particular configuration of those 3 environment cells. So a position, orientation, and also state. We have 3 cells, so we can have 8 different states that they can be in, right? Each one can be on or off. So we have 2 to the 3, or 8. And it's these 2 graphs that come together to produce all of the possible glider lives that can exist in this 5x5 periodic universe. And we do that by applying these constraints that I mentioned earlier. Okay? So let's do that. It turns out when you put these 2 together, there are 20 possible lives that a glider can live in this 5x5 universe. And all of them correspond to basically a single glider looping around the torus forever in an empty universe. So if you put any on cells in the environment in a 5x5 universe, that will destroy the glider. Okay? So all this stuff ends up simplifying down when we impose all the symmetries that I've mentioned, basically to this one kind of life. That a glider in an empty environment just keeps going back to a glider in an empty environment. Its embedding changes, where it is in the universe changes, but its actual state, its actual form does not. Okay? So this is a really, really boring, simple life. Notice it's immortal, by the way, but it's an immortal life of complete boredom, right? There's never any non-trivial interactions. But this shows you the basic idea. You can also work this out in 6x6 and 7x7, which we have done. And in those universes, the lives are somewhat richer, and they're not just terminal. So they're not just immortal, they can also be terminal, like the one I showed you earlier. Okay, and they fit together in various structures and so on. So if I have more time, maybe I'll show you that later. Okay, one last step here. Given that we've got this simple toy universe, we might as well push it as far as we can. In a universe that's as small as 5x5, we can actually go further and map out all possible histories of the entire universe. Okay? In a 5x5 universe, there are 2 to the 25 possible configurations of that universe, which is about 33.5 million configurations. And we can look at what happens to every one of those states. What are all the possible ways this universe can evolve in time? And if you do that, you end up with a graph that's disconnected into a forest of trees that are rooted in periodic attractors. There are 5,181 different different subgraphs that are disconnected from the rest. And because of symmetry, they reduced to 55 symmetry classes, which is what I'm showing you here, with the multiplicity under here. So this particular set of histories of the universe, there are 50 that have this form, okay, but different embeddings, basically. That one up there at the top that only has a single form is actually only represented schematically as a circle, although I have the graph. The graph drawing code I'm using can't draw it because it has over 23 million configurations to it. And that represents all possible histories of the universe that go to the vacuum state. That is, that go to an empty universe, all zeros. And that's actually known in the game of life to be an enormous attractor. Most patterns disappear over time in the game of life. Not all, because you see these other things. So we're looking at the entire set of possible histories of this really, really simple toy universe. Now we can ask, well, wait a minute, where do the glider lives fit into this picture, right? The glider lives have to be subsets of this picture, and in particular, they're subsets that admit of a glider environment split, basically, right? They're configurations that contain a glider, and if you haven't found it, it's right there in red. There are 20, remember, of these immortal lives that correspond to a loop of just walking around an empty environment. And that's where they fall in this picture of the history of the glider or the game of life universe. So given this kind of analysis, we can now start to ask and answer particular quantitative questions about glider lives in these universes. So for example, just to give you one example of this, we can ask, what is the probability distribution of perturbations or glider, again, experiences? You know, what kinds of things can a glider experience during its life? In a 5x5 universe, it turns out only black and gray classes can be experienced. In a 6x6 universe, you get all 6 classes with a particular distribution. And in a 7x7 universe, you get a related picture, but you see that some of the classes are much, much more commonly experienced, and others of them are much, much rarer. You could extend this, and we've been looking into this but haven't done it yet, to look at, for example, distributions of particular sequences. So for example, it turns out that repeated blue sequences of perturbation, so blue, 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 are quite common in glider lives. But we could look at exactly how that depends on the size of the universe, right? And how it depends on a blue blue versus a blue 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 versus a blue 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 blue, and so on. We can ask questions about these glider lives once we've worked this out. All right, it's been 45 minutes. I have one more hopefully discussion stimulating point among many to make, and then I've got 2 wrap-up slides. And then we'll shift to the discussion set. Okay? All right, I want to draw your attention to one other interesting, I think it's interesting, wrinkle that is sort of implied by what I've said so far. And that really comes down to an observation about these perturbation classes that we've been studying the structure of. Okay? So far, everything I've been saying, all the analysis that we've been doing has kind of been performed by us playing an external observer, peering down into this game of life universe, but outside of it, right? So we look at this grid of 1s and 0s and the geometry and topology of it and so on. We identify a glider and its form and its state, its orientation and chirality. We pick out its environment. We characterize how these different environments affect the glider in different ways and so on. That's all being done in the standard objective scientist stands outside the system sort of perspective, right? However, given that we've now worked out the way a glider perceives its environment, kind of a second perspective we can talk about now on this universe, which is the perspective of the state of the universe from the glider. where we see all this complicated structure and may identify not just gliders, but blinkers and blocks and all the kind of rich phenomenology that people talk about in the game of life, a glider inside the universe can only make 6 distinctions. Okay? Everything that falls within one of these classes, even though it's obviously different to us, the glider treats the same way. So there's a tremendous amount of compression of distinctions. And there's also distinctions it makes between, say, gray classes and green classes, which make no sense to us. Right? They're not intrinsic to the glider universe. You could have carved up the states of the universe many, many other ways. But the glider, by virtue of its organization, by virtue of the network of processes that make it, and the sensitivity of those processes to one perturbation versus another, it imposes structure on this game of life universe. And we've worked out that structure, these 6 different classes. So this is kind of an Umwelt, if you will, of a glider. Right? Umwelt is this concept from von Uexküll. It's the world as experienced by a particular organism by virtue of its construction, of the way in which it's made. We can actually characterize in full detail the Umwelt of a glider. And so we have this thing where we now have a very, very simple point of view on the glider or the game of life universe, which is completely different from our point of view from the outside looking in. And I think, I don't have anything more to say about this, but to draw your attention to this seems like an interesting possibility to explore the interaction, the interplay between different perspectives on a universe from the outside and from the inside of that universe. And all the analysis I've done here isn't specific to a glider. You could do this for any kind of bounded, persistent, emergent individual in the game of life. And in fact, you could do it for other cellular automata too, as long as they have bounded, persistent individuals. So you could compare and contrast different perspectives from the inside that arise, and maybe ask questions about bringing perspectives into accordance or something. I'm just wildly speculating now, but it seems like this might be a tiny little toehold into this question about perspectives inside a universe versus outside external perspectives. All right, now I want to wrap up, and then we'll get to the dissection of my talk. All right, so to summarize, what I'm trying to do here, very modest, right, is basically taking the ideas from the biology of cognition from Maturana and Varela's. I'm actually looking to bridge these physics, chemistry to biology to cognition. Again, we should talk about each of those things as it manifests in this simple model, but this is something that we want to do. It's something that we have no idea how to do, and it's vastly, vastly too complicated in the physical universe to do. And so this is the kind of thing that toy models, in the sense that I use them, is intended to do. Let's work through these issues in a specific, concrete toy universe where we can start to grapple with these things. I'm not suggesting that every word I've used here or every decision I've made is the right one, okay? But there aren't any other models where you can draw this length of connections. And so it seems like a really good place to start debating our intuitions about these things. You could replace this with other concepts than Maturana and Varela's, and again, ask how they flesh out in the context of something like a cellular automata universe. So in particular, I've briefly alluded to doing this for autopoiesis, and I've spent a little more time trying to show how you do it for structural coupling. And in particular, I've tried to flesh things out to the point where you can actually calculate things. To me, that's what a theory ought to be able to do. Okay? Yes, you may say, self-organization, organizational closure, structural coupling, autopoiesis, whatever your terms are, you can construct all kinds of stories in words about things. But what I'm trying to do is take a set of concepts and say, well, maybe Maturana and Varela meant this. Here's one interpretation of how they defined autopoiesis, and flesh it out to the point where you can actually derive the organization of an entity in this game of life universe. You may have a different interpretation or a different framework. That's fine. The purpose of this exercise is to flesh them out to the point where you can actually calculate these things. Oh, one other thing, I always have to say this, I hope it's obvious, but people always seem to think that I'm crazy enough that it's not. I am not claiming, number one, that a glider is alive. Okay? I'm claiming that certain ideas about how to think about life from Maturana and Varela can be explored and fleshed out in this toy universe applied to something like a glider. I am not saying that a glider is cognitive. Okay, everybody has different ideas about what they mean by cognitive. I'm saying that certain ideas about how cognition is related to biology, and in particular grounded in the conditions for existence and persistence of the underlying agent that is cognizing, how those ideas can be explored in this toy model. Okay, so when I use words like biology and cognition, I'm talking about them in those terms. Okay? All right, last slide. So this was autopoiesis and enaction. I haven't talked much about enaction except to explain that why I went from enaction to Maturana and Varela's ideas, because they're the ground upon which at least core enaction concepts are built. So let me end by returning to the idea of enaction, and this is the idea of enaction as Varela saw it. This is actually a version of one of his diagrams, although I've modified it a little bit. So the basic idea of you have a universe, okay, that's this blue sea down here at the bottom, and using the particular ideas of autopoiesis, or what he ultimately abstracted to autonomy, particular organizations of networks of processes become autonomous or autopoietic in the sense in which they meant it. And these autopoietic or autonomous networks become identities. That is, they become things that are distinct from the background in which they exist, and for which we can ask questions about them and how they interact and relate to their background. So by the very nature of the organization of this thing that has now arisen from this sea of processes, it defines a domain of interactions, which we've explicitly worked out for the glider case. Okay? And that domain of interactions, by virtue of collapsing some things together and accentuating other distinctions, actually projects, that's Varela's word, a world of significance onto this universe. So some states or some differences between states in this universe mean something to the glider. And by mean something, I'm not talking about some theory of semantics. I'm talking about they have a discernible consequence on the future behavior of this entity. Okay? So by virtue of the interactions that it can and cannot engage in, it makes distinctions or fails to make distinctions about its environment, which is this new field of structure on this otherwise physical universe. And it's not magic. There's nothing, I haven't pulled a rabbit out of a hat here or anything. I've shown you step by step where this comes from for the glider. Okay? And basically, Varela's notion of enaction is all about the co-emergence of an identity and a world of significance to that identity through the actions that it engages in. In fact, the word enact literally means to bring forth through action. It dates to the 15th century, and it was originally used first to refer to the way in which artistic performers bring forth, they enact a performance on the stage by actually performing it between themselves. And it subsequently became to be used in the sense of enacting legislation, where legislative bodies give rise to new laws through the actions they take as legislative bodies. So what I've tried to do is concretely illustrate each of these somewhat dangerous words, right? That's why I'm getting ready to be torn apart here. In a very concrete, sort of simple-minded way, by working all these concepts through in this toy model. But of course, much still remains to be done, and as I said before, this is a research program in progress, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In keeping with our ancient traditions, we will begin with the student questions. After about 15 minutes or so, we will allow everyone else to stop sitting on their hands and ask their questions as well. So, students.
Am I
Oh, you're
directing here? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Great talk. Really interesting analysis of the game of life. I'm curious about your usage of the word perception in regards to the construction of the umwelt that you have for what is it, the gliders. It seems like you can construct a very similar umwelt for like springs, for instance, that determine whether or not they stretch out or compress, if you want to talk about states of the umwelt with regards to states that they'll enter. But I do feel a little hesitant to describe that as perception in some respect, because it seems like there's it's not offering any information for selection on, or what is it, doing anything to motivate a selection. It actually is selecting for that quote-unquote organism. So in the case of the glider, it's that certain configurations of the universe will force it into certain consequences, but it doesn't seem to necessarily be a result of the selection process, but rather just the structure of
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple of questions. One is perception is one of a bunch of words that I used with implicit quotes, right? I think I explained specifically what I mean, though, is that it's distinctions that this system can or cannot make about its environment. And I think it's fair to suggest that that's at least a precondition for perception, if not the full content of what some people would mean by perception. So I'm not engaging in that debate at all. I'm not trying to tell you how to think about perception. I'm just trying to use words that help make it a little clearer as to what I'm trying to point at. Now, the other part of your question, I think, so it's true that, I mean, any physical unity has a, in that sense, would impose a set of distinctions that it is or it is not sensitive to. It's really important in Maturana and Varela's framework, and maybe I didn't do it justice, that these two concepts of autopoiesis and structural coupling go together. Okay, I mean, if you have these structural distinctions in a system that's not autopoietic, then they have nothing to say about that, right? It's the fact that the system is first autonomously sort of self-producing, self-individuating, right? And it's engaging it's engaging with the environment, making distinctions that is important for the view they want to put forward. These aren't sort of independent conditions. I guess the flip side of it would be, I mean, I guess you could conceive of an autopoietic system that didn't make any distinctions, but it seems harder, right? Because it'd have to be so abstract. It wouldn't. I mean, this is pretty abstract, but it'd have to be even more abstract than this, because any organization that's actually embedded in something, that something is going to have consequences, right? When you perturb it. So I guess it's just the other way, that you conceive of a system having distinctions but not being autopoietic or autonomous or an emergent individual in this way. I guess that's how I would. Yeah, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, can I just follow up real quick and ask a question? So I understand. I do respect your usage of the word perception in this context, but I am curious as to what would you see as necessary to add into the game of life, or so what complexity is missing for you to be comfortable about saying?
So I'm not taking a stand. I mean, to some extent, these are your words. These are other people's words. So what I would say is, what do you want perception to mean? And if you can turn that into a concrete enough thing, then we could actually apply it to the system and say, nope, that doesn't work, right? And the same thing is true for all the other words I went like this with, right? This point of view, okay, this umwelt, and so on. Every one of those are going to mean different things to different people. And I think when you have a concrete model, the onus is on the person asking the question to say, well, these are the particular conditions, and I'm stating them precisely enough that if you had a universe that you could do any experiment without any limitations, like this one, that's the whole point, it should be possible to take any concept you have and turn it into some kind of a test, right? And so these kinds of models, that's their purpose. I really don't care, in one sense, how it turns out. I'm certainly not saying that the game of life captures everything that's interesting about the physical universe. In fact, I can enumerate a long number of things that even physically are quite wrong with the physics of the game of life, right? Let alone chemically or biologically or cognitively or whatever. It's meant as an existence proof, as a showing the way in which these things can actually be debated and fleshed out. So maybe I'm squirming around your question, but
No, I think that got to it.
okay.
Yeah, I'm curious, what happens if you make the grid, make the world really large? And is there any kind of glider, like, are these the only kinds of gliders that there are? Or
People have characterized
like
thousands of different structures, and the most important point to make is that the game of life is known to be computationally universal. So pretty much anything that you can do computationally can be embedded in a large enough game of life universe. I'm not making any essential use of that, except that in one sense, a priori, I'm not leaving anything out, right? At least compared to any other computationally expressible theory, right? But I mean, people have characterized thousands of these things. If you go and look on a Game of Life wiki or something, I'm not one of these, although may I sound like, but there are people who spend their lives, doing taxonomy essentially on these structures and discovering new kinds of gliders with new periods and so on.
Do you think it'd be worthwhile to do sort of your analysis on like all of these, or
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I would think not.
Okay.
In the sense that, I mean, you could do it. The techniques are general enough, but you have to have a point. What is the point?
Yeah, I don't
right?
know.
I mean, if, like I said, we had a concept of perception, say, that one could flesh out and apply to this and show that it was missing some critical element, then you could ask the question, well, is it possible that a richer entity than the glider might engage that? Or would we have to move to a new cellular automata? Or is there something fundamentally limiting about the discreteness of cellular automata that says we have to move to some continuous model or something? I mean, that's what I would do. Just, turning the crank and doing it again. I mean, I've actually done some of this for blocks and blinkers as well, which are two simpler structures that don't propagate. In fact, most of the ideas were worked out on blocks and blinkers just because they're easier, until I sort of had the formulation down, and then I applied it to the glider, which was kind of the minimally interesting one to me. So,
Thanks.
I think there was, yeah.
Yeah. Have you looked at like the use of from the glider's perspective, building an adaptive filter that you could then put back onto the world that the glider lives in, and see if you would get some like resonances?
Well, the glider can't do anything more than I've characterized, right? The glider has no more physical degrees of freedom to work with, so it would have to be some richer autopoietic structure that could do more complicated kinds of transactions. And I mean, if one spelled out exactly what sort of an adaptive filter you wanted, because of the computational universality, you could certainly embed that in a structure in the game of life. Have I looked at it? No. I've taken a pre-existing entity. I didn't build the glider. It pre-exists. It shows up spontaneously from random initial conditions. I've taken a pre-existing entity and tried to analyze it according to these concepts of enaction, in particular autopoiesis and structural coupling. Yeah.
Very cool talk. I'm wondering about the application of this in different arenas, and I'm just wondering, what do you think are the places that demand this sort of approach in industry or in academia or just modeling?
Yeah, I mean, so I have no applications in mind. I don't think this solves any technological problem. The point of this is to take debates that are being carried out largely verbally about very fundamental concepts underlying how to think about biological systems in the physical universe and cognitive systems in a biological, embedded in a biological organism, and try to work out their consequences. It's sort of looking at what might a theory someday look like of these things. This isn't offering one. I don't want to oversell anything I'm doing. But that's sort of my long-term thing, is I'd like to see this develop into something that might be more theoretically useful in, say, a really simple actual biological organism, or to get some insight into, for example, I've suggested this might be a useful toy model to think about what it means to have a perspective emerging within a system rather than being imposed from the outside on a system. Those are very theoretical or, dare I say, philosophical concerns. So I have no particular applications in mind. People use cellular automata to do various things. You can do various sorts of image processing, for example, with cellular automata. If you impose the right rules, you can do edge finding and all that kind of stuff. But there's lots of other ways to do that too. I'm not putting forward any application here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the philosophical component, because I had kind of a philosophical question for this, which maybe has a mathematical answer in this case. During the talk, I was thinking about the thought experiment of Odysseus' ship, the
Yeah.
one. So basically,
Theseus,
I'm wondering,
Yeah.
was it Theseus' ship?
Yeah. The ship of Theseus in particular.
So I was wondering, how do we know if this is a persisting thing, or if each time it crashes, it makes a new glider in the next
And
area?
I mean, that distinction doesn't physically exist in this universe if you accept my light cone thing. If you don't, then, I mean, so for example, I could impose a different structure. I could say that gliders only persist within the 5x5. So the moment they move outside of 5x5, then it's not the same glider anymore, right? I don't think that's very defensible given the way the physics works. That affects spread one cell per time unit. But you could say that, in which case it would come out different, right? But I mean, in a discrete time system, there is nothing between one tick of the clock and the next tick of the clock. You can't talk about the universe under those conditions. So yes, it's possible that between every tick of the game of life clock, I'm actually went in there, erased the old glider, and put in a new one in just the right position so that it looked as if it correctly responded to the same perturbation. But there's no physical sense in which that could possibly make any difference in the operation of the game of life universe. So I don't know, that may not be very satisfying from a philosophical point of view, but physically it just doesn't make any sense. Again, physically in this universe. Maybe in other universes it would. I mean, it certainly makes sense in an implementation of the game of life, of course, there is time between one tick of the clock and the next tick of the clock. In my actual computer that's simulating this, right, you can ask questions about it. But then you step below the level of the physics as put forward in this model. So you're asking a question about a different universe, and the answers could be different. I mean, arguably a glider is not autopoietic with respect to the electrical signals that flow through the computer that's simulating this. Autopoiesis itself is a relative term. It's autopoietic with respect to some process structure, some set of processes and components, right? So, I mean, all questions could come out differently if you change the level of of what constitutes the ground of your physics in a universe. Again, maybe not very philosophically.
So I can no longer stem the flood.
Okay.
The faculty will be heard, and actually Jeff had his hand.
Okay, thank you, because I wasn't paying attention to that.
Right.
So I have a question. I think it's consistent with your emphasis on formally trackable questions that are also philosophical. I'm thinking if you went even one further layer of abstraction and imagined all possible rule systems on this kind of pixel world, I guess that's
Okay.
all possible cellular.
Yeah, people do that, actually.
Okay, so then, and then the concern, I guess, that kept coming up is like, okay, with this particular set of rules, we could look at gliders, we can make Turing machines, it looks like autopoiesis, and it's very compelling. But then if we just sort of sampled across all possible rules, was it jury-rigged just to get this nice thing that looks autopoietic? Or do you actually, across all kinds of different rules on a pixel world, see
Well,
these
I mean, so for example, I mean, pattern formation is important. I mean, it's easy to make rules where all patterns decay to the vacuum state in one step, right? I mean, you're just never going to see anything interesting in that universe because the vacuum state pretty much characterizes the single thing that can happen, right? So you need universes that have a richness of structure. Computation universality is not essential. I'm not using that in any particular way. It's not built into any of Maturana and Varela's notions. It's simply a nice benefit to point out that I'm not a priori setting anything aside, right? Because anything that can be expressed computationally can be expressed in this universe. I'm not using that fact, but I think the more interesting question is, to me, finding cellular automata that preserve some of these properties but are somewhat more physically defensible. Right? And people do this. I mean, there are people that simulated Navier-Stokes equations using cellular automata with the right rule. You can get macroscopic things that are described by Navier-Stokes, fluid flow equations, right? So it's more interesting to me to say, okay, it's too easy to form these persistent bounded structures in the game of life. It's much harder in the real world. Why is that? Well, one of the things is that the game of life, physics is intrinsically dissipative. Okay, in the physical world, you've got to work to form dissipative structures. You've got to pump energy through them, right? It takes a lot more organization to feed off a sufficient flow of sufficiently low entropy energy to construct and maintain these structures. Here you get it for free because it's intrinsically dissipative. So there's one direction you might want to look in, right? And related to that, there's no conservation laws in the game of life. You can do statistical mechanics in the game of life. I've done it, others have done it, but it doesn't look like thermodynamics, right? That because of the fact that it's not conservative and it's not at base reversible and so on and so forth. So I mean, I think it'd be more interesting rather than just look at all possible rules, which essentially, you know, is the entire computational universe in one sense, certainly the Turing computational universe. And instead look at things that preserve some of the features that make the physical universe different from this toy model, and yet we still see these interesting, you know, bounded, organized structures that interact and couple with their environments in very rich ways.
Quick thought.
You're okay.
So I guess just maybe motivate my question a little more. Like if you sampled from the space of all possible cellular automata, I guess what I'm wondering is, would you routinely find these autopoietic systems, or is it really like a very small measure zero subset of the set of possible?
Okay, two things. One is you have to be careful. The space of all possible would be infinite, and so defining measures over infinite spaces is very hard. But so, for example, if you looked at all possible more neighborhood additive, you know, cellular automata, people have done that, and it turns out that the game of life is actually at a critical point in the cellular automata rules, and there's a few other rules in the same class that are at this critical point. Most of them just degenerate into chaotic mess, and you never get any persistent structures on one side of the transition. On the other side of the transition, you just decay to quiescence. You just decay to the vacuum state. So you do, but this goes back to what I said before. It's the pattern-forming ones which tend to lie on this sort of critical boundary in rule space, at least in the spaces that have been looked at, that you certainly want to look at, right? Because structure can't develop and persist in away from that. You get either too much order or too much chaos, basically.
Age of chaos.
That's, yeah, I mean, that's the word some people have used to refer to it. That concept has turned out to be a little more complicated than was originally thought. But there is this notion, which is showing up in all kinds of areas, that these critical points tend to be the ones where the richest kinds of behavior can happen. You know, I think he was next, right? Yeah.
So, thank you. I learned a lot today. But one of the sort of persistent questions about Maturana and Varela and autopoiesis in general has been its sort of slightly more solipsistic nature. Right? It's very kind of internal. There are people like Swenson and Turvey that kind of criticize this and say, the minute you have open thermodynamic systems, which is an example you just gave in answer to the earlier question, where you have entropy creation in these systems, where these systems have a kind of drive to go in a certain direction. So if an organism you've depleted of some food resources, it's going to start taking activity in order to go find stuff.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, you know, wouldn't it be more powerful to have some kind of, you know, thermodynamic agent that kind of drives the evolution of these autopoietic systems?
Well, I mean, so part of that I've already answered in that I think the most interesting direction to go would be to look at more physically grounded kinds of things. I will point out, though, that it was absolutely crucial to work this out the way I did, that I could first work out the autopoietic structure and then work out the interactions. Mm-hmm. In the physical world, the kind of things you're talking about, you can't do those as two separate activities. They're intertwined, right? And that is a crucial feature which I would think you would want to incorporate in any further extension of this kind of approach. But I couldn't have gotten as far as I did if it weren't the case that first I could take the concepts, you know. I'm not, a lot of people, I think, incorrectly criticize Maturana and Varela because they haven't read the stuff carefully enough. What they were trying to do was say what features of a biological system can be abstracted from the materiality. And their autopoietic idea was an answer to that question. And any materially embedded system that has to deal with the full set of thermodynamic flows and everything, you don't step outside the class of autopoietic systems. You elaborate that class with particular material constraints. And I think it's a misunderstanding that has unfortunately been supported by some of their choices of words that the autopoietic concept is solipsistic. Okay? They never intended it. In fact, the word closure that they used to talk about organizational closure was never intended to mean sealed off from the environment, which is the way most people have interpreted it to mean. Okay? They actually meant closure in the mathematical sense of an operator being closed with respect to a domain, right? And the operator here is the network of processes that is acting, and the closure is the persistence of that thing under the action of the operations, not that it's cut off from its environment. They don't require a thermodynamic flow to instantiate autopoiesis, but they don't disallow it either. And in fact, they talk about living systems are autopoietic systems operating in the physical domain. So they define living systems as autopoiesis plus materiality. Now, one can debate that, but they never went into define living systems as just autopoietic systems. And that's part of the reason why I would never claim these are alive, even if I were silly enough to claim it for any other reason. Because by their own terms, this wouldn't satisfy that materiality.
Give me a spivey then, Paul.
Okay.
I've got a couple questions. One is methodological and the other is theoretical.
Okay.
I'll do methodology first. And the question is about your distinction between all possible perturbations and then that are survivable,
Yep.
and then shrinking that down to the natural
Yes.
perturbations that are survivable.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's even more, a finer nitpicky subcategory inside there that you might even call ecologically valid perturbations. So some of these perturbations involve having cells get turned on right behind
Yes.
the glider.
Yes, but those can always occur as initial states in the physical universe. That's why I don't make that distinction. But you're right. If you add an additional constraint that there's some sort of a probability distribution on those occurring, then these so-called Garden of Eden states, which can only occur as initial conditions, they have no flow into them, whereas other states have multiple flow into them. And so you could certainly look, that was partly what I was getting at with looking at the probability distribution, not of individual perturbations, but sequences of perturbations. So that's a perfectly legitimate thing, right? In that picture of all possible histories of the universe, the things on the edge are Garden of Eden states. They can only occur as initial conditions.
So do you have some estimate of the number of types of perturbations that a glider can survive that...
Well, it's not, again, all types can show up. All 6 of the classes show up. It's got to be a question about sequences.
Yep.
That some sequences aren't going to occur unless you cook the initial conditions of the universe very specially, whereas other sequences will occur quite naturally. So have I done that? No. You'd need to put some sort of a probability distribution of that sort on the entire history of the universe, which I can only work out for 5x5 at the moment. Although I've actually worked out all the attractors in 6x6, but not the transient trees. There's just too many of them. So does that sort of answer your question? I think it is a useful distinction to make. It's not something that I've looked at. I treat any configuration of the universe as a possible configuration currently.
My theoretical question is, you kind of touched on it in talking to Ramesh about where autopoiesis is where a set of material elements or computational elements form a kind of identity. And
yeah, specifically, there's 2 conditions. There's a self-production condition and a self-distinction condition that you have to cash out in order to argue that you have an autopoietic system.
So a lot of times my reading of enactivism has seen a kind of bouncing back and forth between focusing on the identity of an organism that is maybe self-produced and now self-maintaining itself. But then there's also the constant emphasis on the fact that it's interdependent on its context, on its environment.
Yeah.
And so that chips away at the notion of it being autonomous and having an identity. If it's so.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much what he was talking about. And I said that's a special feature here, that one way to think about it is that gliders can persist in an empty universe. And no material dissipative structure can do that, right? It needs flows of low entropy to persist. And that's a fundamental difference that I've taken advantage of here so that I could first work out an interpretation of autopoiesis in this simple physics and then analyze the interactions. In reality, you can't pull those things apart. That was exactly what I was saying there. And so that's a theoretical problem as to how to deal with a situation in which you have to sort of do both of those at the same time. What does it even mean to have an identity? Another way of thinking about it is the notion of identity is very algebraic here. It's kind of the fixed point of an operator. Okay? Whereas in those cases, it may not be possible to have an algebraic definition of identity. And some people have actually proposing information theoretic sorts of things, where it's not a binary thing. You do or do not have an invariant entity that you can point to as the identity. Rather, you've got some kind of an information theoretic sort of real number you can put on it about how much its actions depend upon its own self versus how much are they driven by the environment. So there's actually a cluster of these things that people have looked at, and that can change from moment to moment too. It's not fixed by an organization, right? I've played with that issue a little bit here, but I never was able to work it out. How, if you basically imagine, so you can imagine a process network, look at the entire universe, so 5 by 5 say, look at all the processes that are active in that universe and unfolded over time, which creates these dependencies. How would you pull out some sub-piece of that process network if you didn't already know that's a glider? How would you pick out a persistent sort of dependency thing? And you basically have to formulate it as kind of a subgraph, isomorphic subgraph isomorphism problem or something, which turns out to be an exponential problem. And I'm still not sure it quite captures the issue there. So that is a very fundamental problem which this does not address, but raises, I think. And there was somebody else who said? Yeah.
Yeah. I first of all, I just want to say I really enjoy this work. Mark Beddoe has an old paper called something like "Can Artificial Life Models Illuminate Theoretical Biology?" And he basically argues that models should be as unrealistic as possible. And I feel like this is a really great example of that sort of working.
Well, I think if you want to actually do science, though, it's fair that they should start unrealistic, but you've got to engage the question.
Yeah, so this is my follow-up.
Okay, yeah.
Is I think a lot about representation in models.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the game of life is fascinating because it creates these lifelike kind of biological-y patterns. But when you're trying to use it to sort of say this is like a real system, you have to think about like what level of organization or decomposition are we talking about? Right? Is this like molecules? Is this like cells? Is this like organisms? And I think you have to be really careful about making intuitions sort of jumping back and forth between levels of organization and saying we can draw influence about cognition from behavior, even if it was like, can we draw intuitions about cognition from the behavior of molecules? A little, but maybe, you know.
So again,
so I want to talk about.
It's important. One of the comments I made earlier, which I did not have time to talk about, but Maturana and Varela's notion of cognition is a particular notion which one may disagree with. And it's that notion that this model is trying to engage. There are obviously many, many other notions of cognition, and this clearly, I mean, if your notion of cognition is the kinds of things that intellectuals do, for example. I'm not saying that's yours, but that's one. Clearly, this is not even on the same planet, right,
Even
as...
if cricket does. Like, even at that low level.
Yeah.
I'm just talking like how
Well, but this has no nervous system. The analog here would be a molecule,
Okay.
right? Molecules, I'm sorry, not molecules, a single-celled organism. That was actually the target of Maturana and Varela's analysis for autopoiesis, was single cells, okay? So that would be the level at which you'd have to ask the question. One thing, though, I want to pick up on what you said. It's really important. When I say I derived an artificial chemistry from Conway physics, that's not unique. The one I derived was based on it's sort of the simplest notion of a configuration of physical entities. But you could, for example, treat gliders as molecules. And in some way, that's actually a better analogy because they are configurations of lower level physical states that interact, come together, bind and break apart and so on. That's actually closer to the way most people who study game of life recreationally think about things like gliders and blinkers and blocks and so on. And if that were your level of chemistry, then an autopoietic entity would have to be something constructed at a much higher level by, all these different lower level things like gliders and blinkers and blocks all interacting. And people actually work at that level, again, recreationally. They actually build these streams of gliders and switches and so on that construct much larger structures. That I picked the simplest step, essentially, above the physics, which let me talk about a chemistry. Also, it's a fact that if you look at the literature on artificial chemistries, this thing I'm calling a chemistry satisfies those conditions of an artificial chemistry. It's a very simple one, but it does. So I'm not just pulling these things out of the air, although that doesn't mean they can't be debated either. So, it really comes down to, like I've said several times, it may feel like a dodge, but the extent to which this has anything to say about cognition, for example, depends a great deal on what you mean by cognition. It was designed to address some things that Maturana and Varela were trying to say about cognition within their framework, which, by the way, was, as I said, was called biology of cognition. They were fully intending to engage issues in cognition, but that may not accord with other people's intuitions about cognition. For example, Maturana and Varela explicitly argue that nervous systems aren't necessary for cognition. They provide a certain set of advantages for the sophistication of the kinds of interactions that you can engage in as an entity with an environment. But there are people who study plant behavior. There are people who study the behavior of single-celled organisms. Whether it's cognition is a separate question, but at least those things are believed to behave. They chemotax, they climb gradients to preserve themselves, and so on. So again, it comes down to what you mean by any one of these terms.
All right, I think that's about as good a place to end for today as we can get. So let's please give a warm thank you.